Hi guys, we're in the third week of our series Potential, where we're talking about the relationships that have the potential to shape how we view ourselves, how we view others, and even how we view God. Today we're going to be talking about a concept I think is really important, and I think it's best illustrated in one of my favorite movies growing up. I loved Jurassic Park growing up, and obviously I was a boy, as a kid, I loved dinosaurs. That's probably part of it, but I also think part of it was just seeing the crazy havoc that came from good intentions, right? They wanted to have a fun theme park, all of a sudden dinosaurs are eating people. Maybe it's summed up in the meme if you've ever seen it. You were so busy wondering if you could, you never stopped to ask if you should, right? This, if you didn't know, this is the original Jurassic Park. I know it's not Chris Pratt, but that's what really counts. Anyways, they say that line in the movie, and I doubt you've ever been chased by a man-eating raptor of your own design, but I think we've all seen this play out in our lives or in other lives, where there's a decision that we could make, but we never ask the question if we should make it, right? Like for instance, Pringles. Pringles has a salt and seaweed flavor. I mean, yes, they can do that, but should they? Or maybe your dad went and bought snow plows for his Crocs. I mean, yeah, they can manufacture and they do sell these, but should they? Or maybe you've passed a car on the highway that had just crazy car repair. Strapping a generator to your car, I don't know if that's street legal, but even if it is, should you? Here's the thing. For me, the big I could, but should I have done it comes to me when I think about my middle school years. About early to mid-middle school, I remember going to my parents and finding out that I could stay up all night on New Year's Eve. I mean, I'd stayed up to midnight before, but they didn't care if I went to bed after they went to sleep. I could stay up as long as I want. Now, keep in mind, this wasn't me going to a party. I didn't invite anybody over. I was just by myself, and I said, hey, I would love to stay up all night, and I can, so I will. And at first it was great. Counted down to midnight, done that before, that was great. Watched the late night TV show, this is awesome. Watched the late night TV show. And then it was like, well, what now? And we didn't have cable, so pretty much all that was on was infomercials about the Miracle Blade. I mean, it was a knife block, and as a middle schooler, I had no idea I needed it, but I was convinced. I mean, I'd watched Chef Tony. We need to order one of these. And then there was a television preacher who wanted checks for my mom, so he would mail me a handkerchief. I mean, like, I watched all this crazy, lame TV, and I remember at the end of the night, I was sitting on my bed, looking at my alarm, just waiting for it to say 6 a.m., the time I normally woke up to go to school, because then I could officially say I was up all night. And then I went to sleep until lunch. I mean, like I could do it, but it didn't really accomplish anything. I remember being incredibly bored at 3 a.m, at 4 a.m, at 5 a.m. Please let this night end. Yes, I had the idea that the freedom that I wanted would be so appealing, but when I got it, I wasn't sure what to do with it. I mean, maybe you've had this happen to you. You were really excited to get your phone. Your parents gave you your own phone. They went through the whole process of, hey, this is really expensive. Don't break it. You got it. But honestly, now that you have it, you kind of hate how much time you spend on it. I mean, you get the screen time report and you're like, really? I wasted that much time? Maybe you were pumped when you got the keys to the car. You were so excited to be able to drive wherever you wanted. And then you saw the price of gas. Maybe, since we're in a series about relationships, your parents said that they were good with you dating, but or maybe in the room and you're like, I didn't ask my parents, I just started dating someone. Maybe you just said, hey, I have the freedom. Why would they tell me that I have the freedom? Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe you're saying, hey, I don't have the freedom to date, but when I do, I'm so excited about. But the truth is, a lot of times when we get the freedom that we're so excited for, sometimes we don't necessarily know what to do with it. And sometimes it comes with limitations that we might not be thinking about. The series is Potential. We're talking about the relationships, again, that change how we view ourselves, how we view others, and even it can impact how we see God. And when it comes to the potential of our romantic relationships, where do you feel like you have freedom? Where do you wish you had more freedom? Here's the thing. It's important to realize that having the freedom to do something actually should lead us to a bigger and better question than is it allowed, is it possible, or should I? We're talking about relationships, but also in the series, we've been talking about the things that go hand in hand with these relationships, especially in our culture. We live in a culture that over-sexualizes everything. And so we've talked about sexuality, what to do with our sexual desires, what God has to say about it. Now, for me growing up, we really didn't have very many sex dating series at church. If we did have one that would talk about romantic relationships, a lot of time we would spend on what God said about sex, which is great. And for the most part, though, when it came to the stuff that I got in church growing up, it was more when we were talking about the topic of sex or sexual desires, it was almost like, listen, don't even worry about it now that you're in high school. In fact, try not to even think about it. And then when you get married, you'll figure it out. And here's the thing. I appreciate the heart behind it because I do agree that God has a plan for sex. God invented sex and God celebrates it within the context of a marriage between a man and a woman. It's what he designed. But I think the lessons that I got kind of missed the point. When we first started the series, I took you to some writings from the Apostle Paul, and I told you guys how he started a lot of churches, and one of them was in a city called Corinth. Now, the city, Corinth, had a lot of ideas that honestly probably be very similar to modern day America, and they had a lot of kind of out there ideas on what gods were, and they definitely had some out there ideas on what sex should be or what it could be, or why not just try it and just see if it makes you feel good. And here's the thing. We talked about the first week, ultimately, how we as followers of Jesus want to honor God with everything. And how one of the best ways that we can have potential for great relationships in our lives is to work on ourselves and to practice showing the love of God that we have experienced. But today I want to take you to another verse in 1 Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 12 says this. He says, you say, and he's talking to the Corinthians, he's saying that they're saying this. He says, you say, I'm allowed to do anything, but not everything is good for you. And even though I'm allowed to do anything, watch what he says here. I must not become a slave to anything. See, Paul hits this tension right on the head. He's saying, hey, listen, you might be allowed to do something, but being allowed to do something doesn't mean you should do something. Let's put it this way. For a lot of people, the message that the church sent to them, and the message that I felt like I received in some of the churches that I went to growing up, is that, well, sex is just wait until you're married and then you can worry about it. But the next question is, well, if that's true, then does that mean I can date? I mean, how often can I date? How many people can I date? Can I date more than one person at once? What's okay physically? What's not? I mean, I'm not dating, but I'm curious about the opposite sex. I'm not actually doing anything physically, so is pornography really bad? I mean, what if it's not pornography? What if it's just images that I see that, it's not like I'm watching sex. I'm just watching things that I enjoy. See, here's the thing. The question our culture seems to constantly ask, or I guess the statement it tends to make is, well, listen, as long as no one's getting hurt, it should be fine. Or if no one's getting hurt, what's the harm? The hard part about that question is no one can really nail down the answer on who's defining what constitutes hurt in any given situation. Our theme verse for the series is Romans 12:2. In it, Paul talks to the church in Rome, and he tells them a goal that I think we should make for ourselves. He says, don't copy the behavior and customs of this world, but let God transform you into a new person by changing the way that you think. Then you will learn to know God's will for you, which is good and pleasing and perfect. My hope for you as you watch this series is that if you're a follower of Jesus, that you won't want your potential romantic relationships to look like what culture says is popular or even acceptable. And honestly, here's the thing. Even if you're in the room and you're watching this and you're thinking, I wouldn't consider myself a Jesus follower, my hope is that your potential romantic relationships wouldn't end up the way the broader culture is. I mean, guys, honestly, when we look at the culture that we live in, when you look at the statistics that you hear about relationships, when you look at what is allowed or acceptable in culture or in pop culture or how men or women are treated, is it really something that you want? I mean, I don't want to upset any Chiefs fans in the room, but look at Taylor Swift, right? Literally one of the most popular entertainers in our generation. She's made a living singing about the hardships and the heartbreaks of relationships. And sure, it might make a catchy song, and it might be the perfect thing to listen to after a messy breakup, but do we honestly want those kinds of experiences? Do we want that kind of life? Guys, the great lie of our culture and the great lie that you are being led to believe is that God isn't for sex. He's not for you. He wants to put it in marriage because he doesn't want you to experience it. He doesn't want you to even think about it. This is totally not true. God designed sex. And here's the thing. In John 10:10, Jesus says this. He says, the thief comes to steal, kill, and destroy. See, so often culture, or really our enemy, is out to kill and destroy the potential for us to have real, lasting, romantic, intimate relationships with people. But Jesus' purpose in John 10:10 is to give them a rich and satisfying life. And yes, that does include a sex life eventually. I mean, God does want you to have a great sex life, but the best way to do that is the way he designed it within the context of marriage between a man and a woman. His will is good. It's pleasing. It's perfect, just like Romans 12:2 says. Now, here's the thing. That's not just scripture, which scripture for me is enough. I would stand on that. But even if you're in the room, you're not a Jesus follower, I encourage you, look up the statistics because the statistics that are gathered consistently back up the Bible. Married couples tend to be happier in their relationship than couples that simply live together or cohabitate before. The stats on satisfaction with sex life and marriage shoot up much higher when abstinence was the case for the person before the marriage took place. I mean, an honest look at our culture will show you that there are tons of confusing messages about sex, about identity, about sexuality, and that's not a new thing. Paul dealt with the same thing. I want to take you to another epistle of Paul's. This is a great chapter. Honestly, I would encourage you to read the book of Ephesians, which is where we're going, and to read the book of 1 Corinthians. But Ephesians 4 talks about this, and he addresses some of the same kind of problems that he was addressing in Rome, that he was addressing in 1 Corinthians. The idea that this culture of the day was saying, hey, follow what's trending, follow what's normal. I mean, hey, just try what makes you feel good. But Paul speaks into that, and he says this. He says, with the Lord's authority, I say this, live no longer as the Gentiles do. And sometimes that word could be translated maybe better pagan. So essentially saying like, hey, live no longer as the people that say, I don't need God, because they are hopelessly confused. Their minds are full of darkness. They wander far from the life God gives because they've closed their minds and hardened their hearts against him. They have no sense of shame. They live for lustful pleasures and eagerly practice every kind of impurity. I mean, listen, that describes our culture. And I don't say that with joy. Our culture wanders around in the dark. I mean, as high schoolers, you have been alive long enough to know that norms are constantly fluctuating. I've known good friends who've had the mantra, hey, listen, it's fine as no one is getting hurt. But it quickly becomes very hard to nail down who gets to define what's hurt. I mean, for instance, growing up, the idea that it was pretty standard. You would date one person, and if you were dating somebody else, that was considered cheating. But honestly, that norm has shifted. There's polygamous couples that's gaining popularity in some circles, and so who's to say if a person cheats on someone that's hurting someone? Maybe that's just really what they needed. From the culture standpoint, how can you say it's wrong? I mean, how can our culture judge any of it? Here's the thing. It doesn't take a serious history student, someone that's looked at the past, to recognize that shifting the goalpost of what is or isn't okay, that's been going on for a long time. I mean, listen, go to the Bible. There's heroes of the Bible who didn't follow the guidelines that God has, and you can see it leads to pain every time. So what do? Well, I love it because in Ephesians chapter 4, so I encourage you to read the whole letter, chapter 5 kind of answers the question. I'll read a couple verses to you. He says this in the very first verse of chapter 5. He says, therefore, in light of what we just read in chapter 4, imitate God, therefore, in everything you do, because you are his dear children. I want to jump down to verse 15, and this is where we're going to end our talk today. He says this. He says, be careful how you live. Don't live like fools, but like those who are wise. Make the most of every opportunity in these evil days. Now, here's the thing. In verse 17, he says, listen, understand for you what the Lord wants. That might sound a little bit like what we read earlier, God's will for you. It's good, it's pleasing, it's perfect. So what I would challenge you to do is to live like those who are wise. Guys, when it comes to our relationships, in light of honoring God with everything, like we talked about the first week, in light of focusing on the people that we want to become, like we talked about the second week, let's not ask the question, what's allowed? Instead, let's ask the question, what is wise? Guys, what is wise is always more powerful than what's allowed. Remember how we first started talking about being excited for freedom? Can I give you an analogy? And again, this is just an analogy. Every analogy breaks down, but I hope it helps you kind of see this idea play out. I have next to me 2 leaf blowers. One of them is battery powered. And you might think I have so much more freedom to accomplish what I need to accomplish with this leaf blower. I can go wherever I want to go. But here's the thing. Even though I have freedom to go wherever I want to go, eventually the battery on this thing will drain. And I'll have to return to the place I got the power to begin with. Now, that is just, again, doing what Paul talked about. Hey, I'm not worried about if I should do it. I just know that I can do it. Instead, if we operate with the idea of, hey, what's wise? To some people, that might feel like it's constricting. Well, you've got a cord on you. You can't go as far as you want to. Oh, that might be true. But the truth is, I actually have more freedom here because I am constantly connected to the thing that powers me. Guys, you can go and do your own thing, and that's what our world does. But when we stay, and not only that, that's what some Christian circles do. They want to follow God, but they sort of, they take scripture and they'll twist it and they say, well, maybe it doesn't really mean that, and they kind of go do their own thing. Here's the thing, staying connected to God and his good and pleasing and perfect will for my life, it might feel constrictive at first, but honestly, that is connected to something that is so much more powerful. So, for instance, in light of the fact that love is patient, like we talked about last week, what's the wise thing to do in my relationship, right? I mean, here's the thing. I remember thinking, oh, once I get married, I won't have to work on any of this stuff anymore. It'll be great. But the truth is, that's not the case. Continuing to build on the things that we talked about is a lifelong endeavor. I remember when I was dating my wife, Sarah. In fact, we just gotten engaged. I had bought an apartment. I moved out. And here's the thing. We were talking about getting married. We were engaged. I mean, we had plans to get married. But here's one of the conversations I remember having with Sarah early on. We said, hey, we could go over to my apartment. There was nothing, absolutely nothing wrong with me going over to my apartment, hanging out, watching a movie. I mean, that's totally fine. But do you know what? We didn't do it. Not because it wasn't allowed. We just didn't think it was wise. We didn't think it was wise for us to be around each other late at night without any accountability. Why? Because we were attracted to each other, but we also knew love is patient. And we wanted to honor God and set a guardrail that we'd say, hey, we want to honor the value that God has, that sex takes place within the context of marriage. So we're going to set this guardrail here. Now, we didn't have to. No one was saying, you can't go over to your apartment. That's wrong. No. It just wasn't wise. You're hanging out with your girlfriend. You could go down to the basement alone. I mean, that's fine. It's allowed. Your parents aren't worried about it. Is it wise? I mean, listen, you can have absolutely no parental restrictions on your phone. That's allowed. Your parents might be fine with that. Maybe they gave you their phone and said, do whatever you like. But is it wise? And by the way, again, this is not a concept that stops after you're married. I still ask the question, not is it allowed, but is it wise? For instance, you could say, hey, Jesse, can you go out to dinner with someone of the opposite sex? Well, technically, there's nothing wrong with that. I could. I mean, it's allowed, but it's not wise. It doesn't honor my wife, Sarah. It doesn't protect her. So guess what? I don't. Now, here's the thing. When we ask the question, not what's allowed, what's wise, we're connected to something so much more powerful. And here's the big thing. The big thing is we can live in freedom and we won't become a slave to anything, exactly like Paul talked about. And not only that, but we'll learn to know God's will for our lives, which is good and pleasing and perfect. So ask the question, what's wise? And as you do, ask how it can change how you approach your potential relationships.